Bitterness, seen in the light of the Grail Message. A work of clarification, enlightenment, and inner correction. Foreword. Why bitterness must be understood today. Never before has bitterness been so widespread, yet so little understood. It permeates individuals, families, institutions, nations, and even spiritual communities, often disguised as justice, discernment, realism, or strength. Humanity speaks loudly of progress, rights, and enlightenment, yet inwardly many carry a hardening that poisons thought, clouds perception, and distorts judgment. This inner condition silently shapes destinies while remaining largely unexamined. Bitterness is dangerous precisely because it feels justified. It does not announce itself as error, it presents itself as wisdom gained through suffering. It whispers that one has been wronged, cheated, overlooked, or betrayed, and that holding on to resentment is a form of self-respect. Thus bitterness becomes protected, even cherished, rather than recognized as a destructive inner state. In the light of the Grail Message, bitterness is revealed not as a reaction imposed by circumstances, but as a choice of inner attitude in response to experience. This distinction is decisive. Where bitterness is seen merely as the inevitable result of pain, liberation appears impossible. But where it is recognized as an inner stance that contradicts the laws of creation, responsibility, and with it, freedom, is restored. Humanity stands today at a point where emotional explanations no longer suffice. The consequences of unresolved bitterness are visible everywhere: hardened hearts, broken relationships, loss of trust, spiritual blindness, and repeated suffering. To continue without understanding bitterness means to continue generating causes that must return in lawful effect. Therefore, bitterness must be clarified, not excused, condemned, or dramatized, but understood in its lawful nature, so that humanity may finally learn to release what it wrongly believes it must carry. The silent poison of the soul. Bitterness does not erupt violently like rage, nor does it always express itself openly. Its danger lies in its silence. It settles quietly in the inner world, stiffening thought, cooling feeling, and narrowing perception. Over time, it becomes a background tone of existence, shaping how a person interprets events, people, and even God. Unlike passing anger or grief, bitterness is static. It arrests inner movement. Where life calls for learning, bitterness insists on judgment. Where the laws offer instruction, bitterness raises accusation. Thus the soul closes itself, not outwardly, but inwardly, while still believing itself alert and awake. This inner poison spreads subtly. Thought becomes suspicious. Speech gains an edge of cynicism or contempt. Deeds become defensive, withdrawn, or quietly aggressive. The bitter person often believes they are merely cautious or realistic, unaware that they have lost the ability to encounter life freshly and openly. Most tragically, bitterness cuts the human being off from higher recognition. The laws of creation work through clarity, movement, and willingness to learn. Bitterness resists all three. It insists on standing still in the past, replaying injuries, and demanding compensation from life rather than growth through experience. In this sense, bitterness is not merely an emotional burden, it is a spiritual obstruction. It blocks the inflow of help, insight, and renewal, not because such help is denied, but because the inner state no longer allows reception. To recognize bitterness as poison is not to condemn the bitter, but to awaken them. Only what is seen clearly can be removed. From emotional justification to lawful recognition. The greatest obstacle to overcoming bitterness is emotional justification. As long as bitterness is defended by stories of unfairness, betrayal, or loss, it remains protected from examination. Emotional reasoning asks, was I hurt? Lawful recognition asks, what inner attitude did I adopt in response? This shift marks the passage from emotional living to conscious responsibility. The Grail Message does not deny pain. It does not dismiss suffering or minimize injustice. But it draws a clear boundary between experience and inner reaction. Experience belongs to the realm of effect. Inner reaction belongs to the realm of new cause. Bitterness arises not from what happened, but from the refusal to accept experience as instruction under the laws. Lawful recognition restores balance. It sees that every encounter serves development, whether welcomed or resisted. It understands that holding bitterness does not correct the past, but binds the present and shapes a burdened future. When emotional justification is replaced by recognition of law, bitterness loses its foundation. Accusation falls away. The soul begins to move again. What once seemed unforgivable becomes understandable, not through excusing others, but through understanding life. This is the turning point offered by this work, the transition from emotional imprisonment to lawful freedom. Introduction. The hidden weight humanity carries. Many walk through life unaware of the weight they bear. They call it maturity, realism, or experience, yet it is bitterness, accumulated, unexamined, and quietly accepted as part of adulthood. This hidden burden drains strength, dulls joy, and narrows the horizon of possibility, while remaining largely invisible to its bearer. Bitterness is heavy because it is unnatural. The human spirit is meant to move, to learn, to unfold. Bitterness resists movement. It anchors the soul to past events, binding energy that should flow into growth. Thus fatigue, disillusionment, and inner emptiness increase, even when external circumstances improve. Humanity often seeks relief through distraction, entertainment, spiritual language, or external change, yet the weight remains. Why? Because bitterness is not lifted by time, success, or escape. It can only be dissolved through recognition. Until bitterness is recognized as an inner state contrary to the laws of creation, humanity will continue to treat symptoms while leaving the cause untouched. Why bitterness persists despite time and change? Time heals nothing that consciousness refuses to address. Years may pass, environments may change, relationships may end, yet bitterness persists because it is carried inwardly. Wherever the person goes, bitterness goes with them, coloring every new experience. Bitterness persists because it offers a false sense of control. By clinging to resentment, the human being avoids vulnerability, avoids trust, and avoids the humility required to learn. It feels safer to judge life than to encounter it openly again. Furthermore, bitterness is reinforced by collective thinking. Society often validates grievance, rewards victimhood, and praises emotional hardness as strength. Thus individuals are rarely encouraged to examine their inner state. Instead, they are encouraged to identify enemies and external causes. Without knowledge of the laws, bitterness becomes normal. Without recognition, it becomes permanent. The Grail Message is the key to true release. The Grail Message brings what humanity desperately lacks: lawful clarity. It does not comfort bitterness, it dissolves it. It does not moralize, it explains. It does not demand forgiveness as an act of will, it enables release through understanding. Through the Grail Message, bitterness is revealed as a signpost, an indicator of resistance to learning, an inner refusal to move with life. Once this is recognized, the way forward becomes clear. Responsibility returns to the individual, not as burden, but as liberation. True release from bitterness does not come through forgetting, suppressing, or spiritualizing pain. It comes through sober recognition of law, acceptance of experience as instruction, and conscious realignment of inner attitude. This work follows that path. Step by step, it leads from confusion to clarity, from accusation to recognition, from emotional entanglement to inner freedom, continuing the Grail-inspired rhythm of clarification, enlightenment, and correction. What is required is not belief, but honesty. Not emotion, but sobriety. Not submission, but recognition. The way out of bitterness is open, for all who are willing to see. Part 1. The Human Misconception of Bitterness. Chapter 1. What humanity calls bitterness. Humanity uses the word bitterness loosely, often without understanding what it truly signifies. It is commonly applied to visible reactions: sharp speech, withdrawal, cynicism, or lingering resentment after injustice. Yet these outward expressions are merely symptoms. They do not define bitterness itself. Bitterness begins inwardly, long before it becomes audible or visible. It is not identical with pain, grief, disappointment, or even anger. These are natural reactions to experience and, when allowed to flow lawfully, they pass and leave behind understanding. Bitterness arises only when the human being holds fast to pain and reshapes it into a fixed inner attitude. Pain is an experience. Bitterness is a decision of will, even if made unconsciously. Pain signals that something has struck the human being deeply. It calls for reflection, learning, and inner adjustment. When pain is met with openness and honesty, it can soften, clarify, and mature the soul. But when pain is resisted, nursed, or turned into accusation, it begins to harden. Thus bitterness is not born in the moment of injury, but in the refusal to move forward inwardly. Pain, resentment, and moral outrage. Resentment often disguises itself as moral outrage. The individual convinces themselves that their bitterness proves their righteousness. They believe they are defending justice, truth, or dignity, when in reality they are defending their wounded self-image. Moral outrage feels elevated. It gives bitterness a sense of purpose. Yet the Grail Message exposes this as a dangerous illusion. True justice is calm, clear, and lawful. Bitterness is heated, repetitive, and inwardly stagnant. Where outrage returns again and again to the same grievance, feeding on memory and imagination, bitterness has already taken root. Resentment is the refusal to let an experience complete its course. It interrupts the lawful movement from experience to recognition. Thus the soul remains bound to what has already passed, unable to receive what lies ahead. Bitterness is justified anger. One of humanity's most persistent errors is the belief that anger, if justified, may be preserved indefinitely. People speak of righteous anger, as if duration were proof of legitimacy. In truth, anger that remains unexamined transforms into bitterness. Justification does not cleanse an inner state. It merely excuses it. The laws of creation do not ask whether anger feels justified, they respond to what is harbored inwardly. Prolonged anger becomes a settled condition, and this condition begins to shape thoughts, speech, decisions, and destiny. Bitterness always insists on justification. Recognition dissolves it. Why emotional pain is not yet bitterness? It is essential to distinguish clearly. Emotional pain alone does not damage the soul. Pain can refine, pain can awaken, pain can instruct. Only when pain is held and cultivated does it become bitterness. This distinction frees humanity from confusion and guilt. One need not fear pain. One must only beware of clinging. Where pain is accepted as a messenger, bitterness cannot survive. Where pain is rejected as unfair, bitterness inevitably forms. Chapter 2. Bitterness is self-protection. Bitterness often arises from the belief that it serves as protection. The wounded human being instinctively seeks to prevent future hurt. Resentment appears to offer emotional armor. If I harden myself, I cannot be wounded again. This belief is deeply deceptive. Bitterness does not protect the heart, it isolates it. It does not strengthen, it stiffens. It does not guard sensitivity, it destroys discernment. True protection lies in clarity and recognition, not in hardness. The illusion of emotional armor. Emotional armor feels strong because it resists. But resistance consumes energy. Over time, bitterness exhausts the very strength it claims to preserve. The bitter person becomes vigilant, suspicious, easily offended, and constantly braced for harm. Life is no longer encountered openly but filtered through expectation of injury. Thus even neutral or benevolent experiences are interpreted as threats. The armor becomes a prison. How resentment pretends to guard the heart. Resentment promises safety by closing the heart. Yet a closed heart cannot learn, love, or perceive truth clearly. It mistakes withdrawal for wisdom. The Grail Message makes this unmistakably clear. Life unfolds only where there is movement. Where bitterness freezes the inner world, development ceases. What was meant as defense becomes decay. Why bitterness actually weakens. Bitterness weakens because it binds the soul to the past. Energy that should serve growth is consumed by remembrance, comparison, and inner argument. Moreover, bitterness disrupts harmony with the laws of creation. It generates new causes of tension, attracting further experiences that confirm grievance. Thus the bitter person believes life continues to wrong them, unaware that their inner state is shaping their encounters. Weakness does not always appear as collapse. Sometimes it appears as rigidity. Chapter 3. Cultural and Social Normalization. Bitterness no longer appears abnormal in modern humanity. It has been normalized, institutionalized, and even celebrated. Entire identities are built upon grievance. Groups define themselves by shared resentment rather than shared responsibility. Thus what should alarm conscience is reinforced by culture. Victim identity and collective grievance. Victimhood offers belonging. It absolves responsibility. It grants moral superiority without inner work. When bitterness becomes collective, individuals feel validated in holding on to it. Yet collective bitterness magnifies suffering rather than healing it. It hardens entire communities, nations, and generations, binding them to historical injuries instead of freeing them through recognition. The laws of creation apply to collectives as they do to individuals. Shared bitterness yields shared consequences. Bitterness rewarded by sympathy. Modern society often rewards bitterness with attention, sympathy, and moral approval. Those who speak most loudly of grievance are amplified, while those who quietly work through recognition are ignored. This inversion discourages inner work. It teaches people to display wounds rather than heal them. Sympathy without clarity prolongs suffering. How society teaches people to hold on. From media to ideology, humanity is subtly trained to remember injuries, rehearse outrage, and preserve resentment as proof of awareness. Forgiveness is misunderstood as weakness, release is mistaken for betrayal of truth. Thus bitterness becomes a badge of consciousness, rather than a sign of inner stagnation. The Grail Message stands in direct opposition to this distortion. It does not call for forgetting injustice, but for moving lawfully beyond it. It does not demand emotional softness, but inner strength through recognition. Closing clarification of Part 1. Bitterness is not pain. It is not justice. It is not strength. It is not protection. Bitterness is a halted inner movement, maintained by justification and reinforced by collective error. To see this clearly is the first liberation. With this clarification, the foundation is laid for enlightenment and correction, and the path opens toward true release, in accordance with the laws of creation. Part 2. What bitterness really is. Chapter 4. Bitterness is inner resistance. Bitterness is not an emotion in the first instance. It is an inner resistance against the lawful course of life. While emotions may accompany it, bitterness itself is an act of will, a holding fast against movement. Life unfolds according to immutable laws. Every experience, pleasant or painful, arises through lawful interaction between past causes and present conditions. Recognition of this truth brings calm and clarity. Resistance to it brings bitterness. Thus bitterness forms when a human being inwardly declares, "This should not have happened to me." This declaration may never be spoken aloud, yet it resounds clearly within the soul. Refusal to accept lawful consequence. Acceptance does not mean approval, nor does it mean passivity. It means recognition that what has occurred did not arise arbitrarily. Bitterness emerges precisely where this recognition is refused. The bitter person does not ask, "What does this reveal?" but insists, "This must be undone." Yet life does not move backward. The refusal to accept consequence therefore becomes a refusal to move forward. This resistance does not alter the law, it only damages the resistor. Where acceptance opens understanding, resistance hardens suffering. The freezing of inner movement. All inner development depends on movement, perception, recognition, adjustment, renewal. Bitterness interrupts this sequence. The soul ceases to flow. Thoughts circle endlessly around the same point. Emotions stagnate. Memory replaces perception. The present is no longer truly lived. This freezing is not imposed from outside. It is self-maintained. Bitterness immobilizes precisely because it insists on standing still while life moves on. Resistance versus recognition. Recognition is active, even when quiet. Resistance is rigid, even when loud. Recognition asks, "What is required of me now?" Resistance asks, "Why was this done to me?" The first opens paths, the second closes them. The Grail Message does not teach resignation, it teaches alignment. Resistance is misalignment. Recognition restores harmony. Chapter 5. Accusation is the core of bitterness. At the heart of bitterness lies accusation. Without accusation, bitterness cannot survive. This accusation may be directed outward toward people, circumstances, institutions, or inward toward fate, God, or life itself. Sometimes it is even turned against oneself. But in every case, it blocks growth. Accusation freezes perception. It replaces observation with judgment. Blame directed outward. When blame is directed outward, the human being relinquishes responsibility for inner development. Energy that should be used for understanding is spent on condemnation. Blame creates an illusion of moral clarity while actually deepening confusion. The accused becomes fixed in the imagination, while the accuser remains bound to them inwardly. Thus bitterness binds the human being to the very object they resent. Judging fate, people, and life. Some bitterness is directed not toward individuals but toward life itself. Such bitterness often appears dignified, philosophical, or world-weary. Yet it is no less destructive. To judge fate is to deny law. To judge life is to deny wisdom. To judge others without recognition is to blind oneself. The Grail Message makes clear, life does not conspire, it responds. Where accusation persists, learning ceases. Why accusation blocks growth? Growth requires openness. Accusation closes. As long as the human being accuses, they cannot see their own part in the chain of causes, not in guilt, but in responsibility. Without this recognition, no correction is possible. Accusation keeps the soul facing backward. Chapter 6. Bitterness in the Past. Bitterness is always rooted in the past. It does not live in the present, though it may intrude upon it. The bitter person carries yesterday into today and mistakes it for reality. The past itself has no power. Only inner clinging gives it life. Living in what has already passed. When memory replaces perception, the present is distorted. The bitter person reacts not to what is, but to what was. New experiences are filtered through old wounds. New people are judged through old disappointments. Thus the past continues to rule the present. This is not loyalty to experience, it is bondage. Why memory becomes a prison? Memory is meant to serve recognition, not domination. When memory is used to learn, it liberates. When it is used to accuse, it imprisons. Bitterness turns memory into evidence, evidence against life, against others, against fate. The soul becomes both judge and prisoner. How the past is kept alive by inner clinging. The past survives only through repetition in thought and feeling. Each replay strengthens its hold. Release does not require forgetting, it requires withdrawing inner energy. When energy is withdrawn, memory loses its grip and becomes neutral. Where there is no clinging, the past rests. Closing clarification of Part 2. Bitterness is inner resistance to lawful consequence. Accusation that replaces recognition. Clinging that animates the past. It is not imposed, it is maintained. And therefore, it can be ended, not by force, denial, or emotional release, but by clear recognition and inner movement in harmony with law. With this understanding, the path toward genuine liberation stands open. Part 3. Bitterness and the Laws of Creation. Chapter 7. Cause and Effect Misunderstood. Bitterness thrives where the law of cause and effect is misunderstood or emotionally resisted. Humanity often accepts this law in theory yet rejects it in lived experience, especially when consequences are painful. When an event does not align with personal expectations, it is quickly labeled unfair. This judgment arises not from insight, but from limited perception. The law does not operate according to emotional preference. It operates according to exactness. Why? Unfairness appears real. Unfairness appears real when the human being sees only the immediate effect and not the preceding causes. Effects often ripen long after their causes were set in motion, sometimes in forgotten thoughts, attitudes, or actions. Because these causes are no longer consciously remembered, the resulting experience seems undeserved. Yet the law never acts without cause. Bitterness grows when the mind insists on innocence without examination. The law working beyond human emotion. The laws of creation are not influenced by tears, anger, or justification. They respond only to alignment or misalignment. Emotion may intensify experience, but it does not alter consequence. When humanity expects the law to bend in sympathy, disappointment follows. This disappointment hardens into resentment if recognition does not occur. The law does not punish, it balances. How misinterpretation creates resentment. Resentment arises when effect is interpreted as attack rather than instruction. Instead of asking, "What does this show me?" the bitter person concludes, "This proves life is unjust." Thus misinterpretation becomes the seed of bitterness. Recognition would have ended the suffering. Misinterpretation prolongs it. Chapter 8. Bitterness is creator of new causes. Bitterness is not passive, it is creative, yet destructive. Every inner state generates causes that must one day return as experience. Bitterness, held inwardly, becomes a new cause, layering future difficulty upon past pain. What began as an effect becomes a cause for further effects. How inner states shape future experience. Thoughts and emotions are not without substance. They carry formative power. A bitter inner attitude sharpens perception toward hostility, injustice, and rejection. The world begins to mirror this stance, not because life conspires, but because like attracts like through lawful resonance. Thus the bitter person increasingly encounters situations that confirm their bitterness. This is not fate, it is self-generated continuation. Why the bitter encounter repetition? Many wonder why similar painful patterns repeat throughout their lives. The answer is simple and severe: the inner state has not changed. As long as bitterness remains, the same type of experience must return, again and again, until recognition dissolves the cause. The law does not tire. It waits. Lawful consequences of inner rigidity. Rigidity blocks correction. Where flexibility allows learning, rigidity insists on defense. Bitterness hardens the inner being. This hardness attracts friction. The consequences are not imposed, they are attracted. Only inner movement, release, recognition, correction, can end the cycle. Chapter 9. Suffering versus bitterness. Suffering and bitterness are not the same. Suffering belongs to life's instruction. Bitterness belongs to human refusal. Understanding this distinction is essential for liberation. Pain is instruction. Pain signals misalignment. It draws attention to something requiring correction. When pain is met with openness and sobriety, it fulfills its task and fades. Pain is temporary by nature. Bitterness is self-inflicted extension of pain. Bitterness begins where pain is rejected instead of understood. The pain may have passed, but bitterness preserves it, feeds it, and relives it. Thus bitterness is suffering without purpose. What could have taught becomes torment. When suffering could have ended. Many lives are burdened not by what happened, but by what was never released. Suffering could have ended at the moment of recognition. Instead, bitterness kept it alive. The Grail Message shows clearly: suffering ends when recognition begins. Bitterness ends when resistance dissolves. Closing clarification of Part 3. The laws of creation are exact, impartial, and benevolent. Bitterness misreads lawful effects as injustice. Creates new causes of repetition. Extends suffering beyond its natural limit. Liberation does not come through emotional discharge, forgiveness rituals, or denial, but through clear recognition of law and personal responsibility. Where bitterness dissolves, strength returns. Where recognition awakens, freedom follows. Part 4. How bitterness distorts the human being. Chapter 10. Distortion of perception. Bitterness does not remain confined to a single emotion or memory. Once established, it becomes a lens through which the human being views all of life. Perception, which should be clear and receptive, becomes clouded. Reality is no longer met as it is, but filtered through accumulated resentment. Thus bitterness quietly reshapes the world the person believes they inhabit. Seeing life through resentment. Where bitterness exists, neutrality disappears. Events are no longer encountered openly. Every experience is interpreted in reference to past hurt. Even neutral actions are suspected of hidden intent. Life is no longer approached with expectation of growth, but with readiness for offense. This is not caution, it is distortion. Suspicion, cynicism, and mistrust. Bitterness teaches the human being to distrust before observing. Goodwill is questioned. Kindness is suspected. Correction is interpreted as attack. Cynicism replaces discernment. Where sober evaluation would weigh facts quietly, bitterness assumes motive and assigns guilt without evidence. Thus truth becomes inaccessible, not because it is absent, but because perception is warped. Loss of inner clarity. Inner clarity requires openness and calmness. Bitterness agitates inwardly, even when outward silence is maintained. Thoughts circle endlessly around perceived injustice. Emotional tension becomes permanent background noise. In such a state, fine perception is impossible. The human being no longer sees, he reacts. Chapter 11. effects on thought, word, and deed. Bitterness always seeks expression. If it is not recognized and dissolved inwardly, it must manifest outwardly, through thought patterns, speech, and behavior. Thus bitterness reshapes the entire human expression. Harsh judgments and sharp speech. Bitter thoughts are accusatory by nature. They judge quickly, harshly, and without mercy, both others and life itself. Speech becomes sharp, sarcastic, or cutting. Even when outward politeness is maintained, the tone carries coldness or contempt. Words lose their power to build. They become tools of defense or attack. The bitter person often believes they are just being honest, not realizing that bitterness speaks, not truth. Withdrawal, coldness, or aggression. Bitterness manifests in two dominant behaviors. Withdrawal, where the heart closes and distance replaces connection. Aggression, where inner tension seeks release through dominance, argument, or control. Both are forms of self-protection that isolate the human being further. Warmth disappears. Spontaneity fades. Relationships grow strained or superficial. How bitterness shapes behavior. Repeated inner resentment trains behavior. The bitter person may avoid opportunities for cooperation, sabotage trust before it forms, react defensively even without provocation, reject help, correction, or closeness. These behaviors then create further painful experiences, confirming the bitterness and deepening the cycle. Thus bitterness becomes self-reinforcing. Chapter 12. Bitterness and Spiritual Blindness. The most severe consequence of bitterness is not emotional discomfort, but spiritual blindness. Bitterness closes the inner eye. Why recognition becomes impossible. Recognition requires humility, openness, and willingness to see oneself clearly. Bitterness resists all three. It insists on blame rather than insight, defense rather than examination. The bitter person seeks confirmation, not correction. Thus even when truth stands plainly before them, it is rejected. Recognition is not withheld, it is refused. Loss of inner guidance. Inner guidance works through fine perception, conscience, intuition, quiet warning, and lawful insight. Bitterness dulls this sensitivity. The inner voice becomes faint, then silent, not because it ceases to exist, but because the human being no longer listens. Decisions are then made from emotion, memory, or impulse instead of clarity. Separation from higher perception. Higher perception requires inner harmony. Bitterness introduces disharmony and tension that sever resonance with higher order. The human being remains alive, active, and intelligent, yet inwardly disconnected. This is not punishment, it is lawful consequence. Where bitterness rules, elevation becomes impossible. Closing clarification of Part 4. Bitterness distorts the human being by warping perception, corrupting thought, speech, and action, blocking recognition and inner guidance, severing connection with higher perception. It does not protect. It does not heal. It does not preserve dignity. It imprisons. Yet this imprisonment is not final. The same laws that expose bitterness also provide the path to release, through recognition, responsibility, and inner movement. Part 5. Bitterness in Relationships. Chapter 13. Bitterness toward others. Bitterness toward others arises where expectation replaces understanding and where offense is allowed to harden instead of being examined. What begins as hurt or disappointment gradually transforms into a fixed inner stance against another human being. Unforgiven offenses. Unforgiven offense is not merely memory, it is continued inner accusation. The event itself belongs to the past, but bitterness keeps it alive through repeated inner replay. Each recollection renews the emotional charge, making the offense feel current, immediate, and unresolved. Forgiveness, in the Grail sense, is not emotional pardon or moral superiority. It is release from accusation, the cessation of inner resistance to what has already occurred. Without this release, bitterness anchors the offended person to the offender, binding both in continued tension. Expectations and disappointments. Many relational resentments arise not from actual harm, but from unspoken expectations. When others fail to meet imagined standards of loyalty, gratitude, fairness, or understanding, disappointment arises. If this disappointment is not examined soberly, it becomes resentment. The bitter person often believes, "They should have known. They owed me. I deserved better." These expectations are rarely communicated, yet their violation is deeply felt. Thus bitterness grows from assumption rather than fact. How relationships harden and break. Bitterness stiffens relationships. Flexibility disappears. Dialogue becomes strained. Small misunderstandings escalate quickly. Warmth is replaced by formality or distance. Eventually, relationships either break openly through conflict, or die quietly through emotional withdrawal. In both cases, bitterness prevents learning. The relationship ends, but the inner pattern continues, ready to repeat elsewhere. Chapter 14. Bitterness toward self. Perhaps the most hidden and damaging form of bitterness is that which is directed inward. This bitterness wears the mask of responsibility, guilt, or moral seriousness, but beneath it lies self-condemnation and refusal to move forward. Regret, shame, and self-condemnation. Regret becomes bitterness when the human being refuses to let recognition lead to correction. Mistakes are revisited endlessly, not to learn, but to punish oneself. Thoughts revolve around, "I should have known. I ruined everything. I don't deserve better." Such thinking is not humility, it is stagnation. Law never demands self-destruction, only learning and alignment. Living in, if only. The phrase, "if only," signals inner captivity. Life energy is drained by constant comparison between what is and what might have been. The present is neglected, the future resisted. This fixation on alternate pasts prevents growth. It replaces movement with paralysis. The human being stands before life, but inwardly remains elsewhere. Hidden self-hatred disguised as guilt. Genuine guilt awakens responsibility and correction. Bitterness toward self disguises itself as guilt, but produces no movement. Instead, it entrenches identity in failure. The bitter individual may even reject opportunities for healing or improvement, believing suffering is deserved. This is not responsibility, it is refusal of grace through law. Chapter 15. Generational and collective bitterness. Bitterness is not only personal. It can be inherited, shared, and cultivated collectively, becoming part of family identity, cultural narrative, or historical memory. Inherited resentments. Children often absorb bitterness without understanding its origin. Family stories repeat grievances. Certain names, groups, or events are spoken of with emotion rather than clarity. Thus resentment is transmitted emotionally, not rationally. What was once personal pain becomes emotional inheritance. Family, community, and historical grievance. Communities and nations can live in bitterness for generations. Historical injustice, conflict, or humiliation becomes identity. Memory replaces recognition. Accusation replaces learning. This collective bitterness is often justified as loyalty or remembrance, yet it sustains division, blocks reconciliation, repeats cycles of harm. Law works impersonally, regardless of group identity. Collective bitterness therefore creates collective consequence. How bitterness is passed on. Bitterness is passed on through language charged with resentment, emotional reactions taught as normal, silence that conceals unresolved pain, narratives that assign permanent blame. Each generation then believes the bitterness is their own, when in truth, it was inherited unexamined. Only conscious recognition can interrupt this transmission. Closing clarification of Part 5. Bitterness in relationships. Binds people to past offense. Distorts expectations and communication. Turns responsibility into self-punishment. Repeats itself across generations. Yet relationships are also the most powerful mirrors for recognition. Where bitterness arises, law invites awareness. What am I holding? What am I refusing to release? What recognition is being avoided? The Grail Message does not call for emotional forgiveness, denial of pain, or forced reconciliation. It calls for inner movement, release of accusation, and alignment with law, through which relationships may heal, or at least cease to poison the soul. Part 6. Why bitterness is hard to release. Chapter 16. Fear of letting go. Bitterness often remains not because it is pleasant, but because release feels threatening. The human being may suffer under bitterness, yet still cling to it, out of fear of what remains without it. Loss of identity without the wound. Over time, bitterness becomes intertwined with identity. The story of injury, betrayal, injustice, or loss begins to define the self. The human being no longer merely has bitterness, they are the one who was wronged. To let go then feels like erasing one's own history or invalidating one's experience. Yet this is illusion. The experience remains as recognition, only the inner resistance is released. Who am I without my pain? This question quietly binds many. Pain gives structure to thought. It offers explanation for limitation, withdrawal, or mistrust. It even provides meaning where inner clarity is absent. Without bitterness, the human being must face the present fully, without excuse, without shield. This demands courage. Thus bitterness persists as a substitute for self-discovery. Chapter 17. False Forgiveness. Many believe they have forgiven, yet bitterness remains intact. This is because forgiveness of words is not forgiveness of the inner state. Words without inner change. I forgive, spoken outwardly does not dissolve accusation inwardly. Where bitterness remains, inner dialogue continues. Revisiting the offense. Rehearsing blame. Measuring justice emotionally. True release requires inner movement, not verbal declaration. Without this movement, forgiveness becomes performance. Spiritual language used as cover. Spiritual phrases are often used to conceal unresolved bitterness. I've left it to God. I'm over it. I've moved on. Yet emotional reaction, sharp memory, or quiet resentment reveal the truth. Spiritual language then becomes a veil, protecting bitterness from exposure rather than dissolving it. Why bitterness survives religious practice. Ritual does not replace recognition. Prayer, confession, or worship performed without inner honesty cannot dissolve bitterness. They may even strengthen it by giving the illusion of righteousness. Bitterness survives wherever self-examination is avoided. Law works regardless of spiritual form. Chapter 18. Pride and the refusal to learn. The deepest root of bitterness is often pride, though it rarely appears openly as such. I was right, as final barrier. Bitterness feeds on certainty of being right. The human being clings to the correctness of their judgment, even when suffering continues. To release bitterness would mean admitting, I may not see fully. There is more to learn. I may have misunderstood law. This admission feels like loss, but is in truth liberation. Pride hidden as moral superiority. Pride often disguises itself as moral clarity, justice, integrity, strength. Yet when these qualities harden into refusal to examine oneself, they block growth. Bitterness thrives where moral superiority replaces humility. Why humility is essential. Humility does not mean self-blame. It means openness to recognition. Only humility allows the human being to ask, what is law teaching me here? What inner resistance remains? What must I change? Not in others, but in myself. Without humility, bitterness becomes immovable. With humility, it dissolves naturally. Closing clarification of Part 6. Bitterness is hard to release because it becomes identity, provides emotional structure, hides behind words and rituals, is protected by pride. Yet none of these are stronger than law. The moment recognition is sincere, bitterness begins to lose its grip, without force, without denial, without suppression. Release is not an act of will. It is the result of seeing rightly. Part 7. The Way Out. Grail Message Clarification. Chapter 19. Recognition over emotion. The way out of bitterness does not begin with feeling better. It begins with seeing more clearly. Emotion binds. Recognition frees. Seeing law instead of feeling injury. Emotion always asks, how do I feel about what happened? Recognition asks, what law is working here? Bitterness arises where emotion dominates perception. The human being feels injured and remains fixed in that feeling, allowing it to interpret reality. The Grail message redirects attention away from emotional reaction toward lawful observation. Nothing happens outside law. No experience is meaningless. No pain is random. When law is recognized, injury loses its central position. This does not deny pain, it places it correctly. The shift from, "Why me?" to, "What does this teach?" "Why me?" is the cry of resistance. It assumes injustice. "What does this teach?" is the voice of recognition. It assumes order. This shift is decisive. The moment the human being seeks understanding rather than justification, bitterness begins to dissolve, not through effort but through clarity. Law does not accuse. Law instructs. Recognition transforms suffering into guidance. Chapter 20. Withdrawing accusation. At the heart of bitterness lies accusation, toward people, fate, God, or life itself. Release begins when accusation is withdrawn. Releasing blame without denial. Withdrawing accusation does not mean saying, "It didn't hurt. It didn't matter. They were right." It means saying, "I will no longer bind myself to blame. I release my inner resistance. I choose clarity over judgment." Blame chains the human being to the past. Release restores movement. This is not moral superiority, it is inner sovereignty. Restoring inner sovereignty. Bitterness gives power away. As long as blame persists, the inner state depends on others, events, or memories. The human being remains inwardly ruled by what has already passed. By withdrawing accusation, the individual reclaims responsibility for their inner condition. No one else holds that power. Inner sovereignty is not control, it is freedom from reaction. Chapter 21. Acceptance of lawful consequence. Acceptance is often misunderstood as weakness or submission. In truth, acceptance is alignment with reality. Acceptance without submission. Acceptance does not mean approving wrongdoing or denying injustice. It means acknowledging. This is what has occurred. This is the consequence now present. I will meet it consciously. Resistance says, "This should not be." Acceptance says, "This is, and now I will act rightly." Acceptance removes friction between the human being and law. Where friction ends, peace begins. Peace with reality as it is. Peace does not arise when circumstances change. Peace arises when the inner state ceases to oppose reality. Law continues to work whether accepted or not. But when accepted consciously, its working becomes constructive instead of painful. The bitter person fights reality. The liberated person cooperates with it. This cooperation restores flow, clarity, and inner calm. Closing clarification of Part 7. The Grail message shows that release from bitterness comes through recognition instead of emotional fixation, withdrawal of accusation instead of blame, acceptance of lawful consequence instead of resistance. No emotional purge is required. No dramatic forgiveness ritual is needed. No denial of pain is demanded. Only seeing rightly. Where recognition enters, bitterness cannot remain. Part 8. Inner Healing and Real Freedom. Chapter 22. Responsibility is Liberation. Bitterness often persists because the human being unconsciously surrenders inner authority. By blaming others, resisting consequences, or justifying resentment, the individual becomes a passive observer of life's unfolding. Taking back inner authority. Recognition begins when the human being accepts responsibility for their inner state. Responsibility does not mean taking blame for all external events, it means taking charge of how one experiences them. The bitter person allows the past or others' actions to dictate thought, emotion, and behavior. The responsible person recognizes that every reaction is theirs to govern. When inner authority is reclaimed, bitterness loses its power. It is no longer fed by unconscious dependence on external causes. Why responsibility dissolves bitterness? Responsibility transforms the passive grievance into active recognition. The human being stops asking, "Why did this happen to me?" Instead, they ask, "How do I meet this lawfully?" This conscious approach aligns thought, word, and deed with reality, dissolving the chains of resentment. Bitterness cannot survive where clarity and self-governance prevail. Chapter 23. Humility and Inner Softening. Bitterness hardens the soul, its rigidity resists reality and blinds to law. Humility is the antidote. Flexibility of the soul. Humility does not mean self-abasement. It means seeing reality clearly, acknowledging the limits of one's own knowledge and control. Inner softening allows the human being to meet events as they are, without the distortion of pride or self-righteousness. This flexibility restores movement. The rigid, "I must be right," posture softens into, "I can learn and adapt." How humility restores movement. The bitter human is trapped in fixed thoughts and emotions, reliving past injuries. Humility allows the soul to bend without breaking, to accept without collapsing, and to let experience teach rather than resist. Recognition becomes natural, and the inner flow of life resumes. Bitterness cannot thrive in a heart that is both aware and humble, for it is the egoic rigidity that sustains it. Chapter 24. Gratitude and Forward Orientation. Healing bitterness is not only about letting go of the past, it is also about turning toward the future with recognition. Turning toward life again. Gratitude shifts focus from what has been wrong to what is present and lawful. Acknowledging even the smallest lessons or blessings opens the human being to possibility. Gratitude softens resistance and invites constructive action. Opening the future through recognition. Forward orientation is inseparable from recognition. One sees law at work, accepting consequence and possibility together. Bitterness fades when attention moves from accusation toward cooperation with life and law. Recognition of lawful patterns allows the human being to act consciously, shaping circumstances without being imprisoned by them. The past is acknowledged, the present is governed, and the future is embraced, freedom restored. Closing clarification of Part 8. The Grail Message teaches that real freedom comes through inner recognition. Responsibility reclaims authority and dissolves resentment. Humility restores flexibility, softens the heart, and allows life to flow. Gratitude and forward orientation reengage the human being with law and opportunity. Bitterness is not removed by willpower, denial, or moral effort. It evaporates naturally when the inner state aligns with truth and law. The human being who applies these principles experiences clarity, strength, and inner peace, no longer enslaved by past grievance. Part 9. Living Free from Bitterness. Chapter 25. Daily Self-Observation. Bitterness does not vanish instantly, it is a condition that arises subtly, often without immediate recognition. Daily self-observation is the key to maintaining inner freedom. Catching resentment early. Human thought and emotion move quickly, often before conscious awareness can intervene. Resentment arises as reaction to perceived injury or misalignment with expectation. By watching thoughts and emotional responses carefully, one can identify the first signs of bitterness before it hardens. Daily attention acts as a preemptive measure, preventing resentment from consolidating into long-term bitterness. This requires sober vigilance, not self-reproach. Observation without judgment allows inner clarity to emerge naturally. Maintaining inner cleanliness. Bitterness stains thought, word, and deed. Sober observation allows the human being to cleanse the inner environment regularly. Correct distorted interpretations immediately. Release blame or judgment while acknowledging lawful consequence. Align perception with the reality of law rather than emotional preference. This daily practice ensures that the soul remains fluid, aware, and capable of recognition, leaving no space for bitterness to root. Chapter 26. Relationships renewed. Bitterness often manifests in human interaction as suspicion, accusation, or emotional withdrawal. Freedom from bitterness transforms relationships. Clear boundaries without hardness. The human being learns to distinguish between self-protection and bitterness. Boundaries become statements of clarity, not walls of resentment. Respect for one's own and others' lawful space replaces reactive defense. This ensures interaction is truthful, responsible, and non-reactive, fostering mutual recognition rather than conflict. Truthful interaction without accusation. Once resentment is released, communication reflects lawful observation rather than personal grievance. Words are chosen consciously, free from the filter of blame. Misunderstandings are addressed soberly, without compulsion or accusation. Relationships transform as the human being speaks and acts from recognition, not reaction, allowing others to respond without defensive bitterness. This is cooperative living in alignment with law. Chapter 27. Destiny without resentment. Bitterness clouds perception of life's lawful unfolding. When it is released, destiny itself becomes more accessible. How life changes when bitterness ends. The inner freedom gained from release allows clearer decisions, unburdened by past grievance. Opportunities to act in harmony with law rather than in reaction to old wounds. Emotional stability, which supports spiritual and practical discernment. Bitterness no longer acts as a filter distorting the future. The human being sees life as it is, not as a series of personal injustices. Walking forward unburdened. The final stage of freedom is forward orientation grounded in recognition. Past events are acknowledged but not relived. Experiences are understood as lawful, teaching lessons rather than generating resentment. Life proceeds lightly, consciously, and cooperatively, allowing destiny to unfold in lawful harmony. Walking forward unburdened is not avoidance, it is active alignment, where every step reflects sober awareness and inner peace. Bitterness cannot return to a mind and heart aligned with law and recognition. Closing clarification of Part 9. The Grail Message illuminates that living free from bitterness requires active engagement with inner recognition. Daily self-observation prevents resentment from consolidating. Renewed relationships foster respect, responsibility, and truthful interaction. Destiny without resentment opens the human being to lawful opportunity and inner freedom. Bitterness is not removed by force or mere forgiveness, it dissolves naturally when the soul operates in clarity, humility, and recognition. The liberated human being experiences inner peace, clarity, and cooperative strength, walking forward unencumbered by the chains of the past. Part 10. Bitterness is a test of maturity. Chapter 28. Why life allows injury. Human experience often involves encounters that cause pain or perceived injustice. These events are not punishments but opportunities for growth when viewed in the light of law and recognition. Development through experience. Life presents challenges and injuries as a test of maturity, giving the soul chance to observe reactions honestly. Recognize inner resistance or pride. Practice conscious alignment with law rather than reacting emotionally. Each painful encounter carries instructional value. When understood correctly, it strengthens discernment, patience, and inner balance. True growth comes not from avoidance, but from sober recognition of law at work. Strength without hardening. Maturity is shown by strength that does not harden the soul. Bitterness creates rigidity, recognition creates flexibility. Enduring injury with clarity develops courage without cruelty, resilience without ego. The soul becomes capable of acting rightly despite circumstance, reflecting true inner mastery. Chapter 29. Those who refuse to let go. Not all humans willingly release bitterness. Some cling to grievance, believing it to be justified. Spiritual stagnation. Holding on to resentment leads to spiritual immobility. Insight is blocked. Growth slows or halts. Inner life becomes dominated by the past rather than aligned with present law. Stagnation is not the consequence of life, but of refusal to recognize law and take responsibility. The law working regardless. The Grail Message emphasizes that law functions independent of human recognition. Consequences unfold whether bitterness is released or not. Resistance prolongs suffering, even while law continues its impartial activity. Release is not about escaping law, it is about cooperating with it to achieve clarity and freedom. Those who refuse to let go remain trapped in self-inflicted limitation, while recognition enables the soul to move forward. Chapter 30. Standing free in inner clarity. The culmination of the process is quiet, steadfast inner freedom. Quiet strength. A human who has released bitterness develops a strength that is unshakable yet gentle. No need for defensive posturing. Actions flow from clarity, not reaction. Presence radiates stability without aggression. Strength comes from alignment with law and recognition of reality, not from domination over others or over circumstance. Peace without defense. True inner peace arises without guarding or justifying the self. Life's events are accepted soberly, yet responsibility remains active. Emotional equilibrium allows the human being to observe and act consciously. Peace does not require external validation, it exists because the soul is aligned with law and conscious of its own freedom. Trust in the justice of the laws. Standing free in clarity requires trust in the impartiality of creation's laws. Justice is inherent in law, not dependent on human approval. The soul no longer seeks retribution, recognition replaces judgment. Life unfolds harmoniously when the human being cooperates with law instead of resisting it. Closing clarification of Part 10. Bitterness is revealed by the Grail Message as a mirror of inner maturity. Life allows injury to develop discernment, strength, and inner flexibility. Refusing to release bitterness results in spiritual stagnation and self-inflicted limitation. Standing free in inner clarity demonstrates trust, peace, and sober strength, aligned with the laws of creation. Maturity is not tested by whether injury occurs, but by how the human being responds. Recognition, responsibility, and release convert challenges into opportunities for freedom, wisdom, and inner sovereignty. Conclusion. Bitterness is not inevitable. Human experience often presents challenges, offenses, and disappointments, yet bitterness is not the necessary outcome. It arises only when the soul resists lawful reality, clings to perceived injustice, and allows emotional reactions to dominate thought and behavior. The Grail Message teaches that recognition of law and consequence is the key. Bitterness is a creation of inner rigidity, not of life itself. Pain, suffering, or injury are neutral, human interpretation assigns meaning. True understanding of law enables the human being to transform apparent injustice into insight and growth. Humans who align perception with law experience life fully yet remain untrapped by resentment, showing that freedom is always possible. Recognition ends what time cannot. Time alone does not dissolve bitterness. Years may pass, yet if the inner cause remains, blame, accusation, or resistance, the soul remains bound. Recognition, however, acts immediately. Seeing the law behind every event restores inner sovereignty. Withdrawing accusation and releasing resentment allows movement where once there was stagnation. The soul becomes flexible, receptive, and attuned to life, rather than imprisoned by past events. Thus, release is active, not passive. It is the product of understanding and inner alignment, not mere passage of time. Freedom through alignment with law. Bitterness is ultimately a misalignment with law and consequence. True freedom comes from acknowledging responsibility for one's thoughts, emotions, and reactions. Recognizing law at work impartially, beyond personal judgment. Releasing attachment to past events, perceived wrongs, or self-created narratives. When the human being cooperates with law instead of resisting it, inner peace emerges naturally, clarity returns, and life becomes a field for conscious action, insight, and growth. Epilogue. A final call to earnest seekers. Lay down the burden. Those who carry bitterness must let go of the burden they believe defines them. The Grail Message reminds us. Holding resentment serves no higher purpose, it obstructs inner lawfulness. To release bitterness is not to excuse the actions of others but to reclaim the soul's freedom. The heart becomes spacious and clear when it releases the weight of past grievance. Choose growth over grievance. Every challenge is a choice point. Remain in accusation, or use experience for inner development. Growth requires courage. Replace judgment with recognition. Transform injury into insight. Let experience teach rather than harden. Bitterness may have been habitual, but it is never permanent. Conscious choice allows the human being to walk forward unburdened. Walk forward in sobriety, clarity, and inner freedom. True liberation is a quiet, sober state of inner clarity. Peace exists without external validation. Actions reflect alignment with law rather than reactive emotion. Strength is measured not by control over others but by freedom within oneself. Those who release bitterness step into a new mode of life, attentive, responsible, and aware. The Grail Message guides the soul to see that freedom is always possible, once recognition replaces resentment. Walk forward deliberately, not in haste or fear, but with steady awareness, humility, and sober joy, trusting in the impartial and just workings of creation's law. Bitterness, once understood, ceases to be a master. Life unfolds as a field of conscious opportunity, in which the soul grows, learns, and flourishes, free, sober, and fully aligned with law.